And we're live. Hello and welcome to the 205th straight week of Hex Therapy Live. I'm your host, Maddie Allen, and I've got a really special show for you tonight. I've been here in New York City to catch the HEX case versus the SEC. And boy, this has been one of the most exciting days of crypto that I've ever had in my life. I got to see 8 of Richard Hart's lawyers give their best cases and strongest arguments for dismissing the case against Hex, and Pulse and PulseX as well, and got to see their arguments against the SEC. And so, what we have going on right now, we had about 75 people join in the courtroom, and the energy was incredible. The content was top notch. And I think everybody walked away being super impressed with Richard's lawyers, and also honestly extremely impressed with the judge and her level of understanding of crypto, and the questions that she was asking for however long it was, an hour and a half or 2 hours of intense questioning of both sides. We heard back and forth from Richard's lawyers. 2 of them spoke extremely well, addressing different issues of whether the case can be thrown out based on jurisdiction. And then 2 of the 4 SEC lawyers that were there were also heading up their parts of the argument. And so we saw it go back and forth based on these extremely thoughtful questions that the judge had asked. So what we're going to do right now, I shared this link out to a number of people, but what we ended up doing was started a Twitter Spaces, and that's going on right now. And that is a cannot miss material. So catch it on the replay from the beginning, because it had an hour of myself and Nuclear Herbs discussing everything we could think of that had just happened in the court happenings. And then also we've had many other people who were there and people who were not there come up as speakers, and that space is still going on now. And so go ahead and check that out. And so if you were in attendance and you want to give your reaction, go to Twitter and join as a speaker and take advantage of that Twitter Spaces. And then for this YouTube episode, I'm just going to quickly summarize as much as I can think of for the next 15 or 20 minutes and call it a wrap. Because as you guys know, I have been Zooming all around the country, telling people about Hex and Pulse Chain, not because I'm paid to do this, but because I'm extremely enthusiastic about where we are in the history of crypto. And that today has been another surreal experience. And I would have to, also mention that in the past week, I talked on Tuesday about getting invited on Sunday to the Trump rally and being in the floor seats of Madison Square Garden next to, Trump's rally, next to all the celebrities there. Most notably, Elon Musk was one person away from me, and I almost was able to slip him a Pulse Chain coin and onboard him, but I think third time is going to be the charm for that. So I think Sami's prediction of me onboarding a billionaire, that almost came true this time, and maybe third time's the charm. So that was an incredibly surreal experience. I was really grateful to the MAGA boys with a Z, because they are the first Federal Election Commission approved meme super PAC. And what that means is that they are allowed to take donations for political efforts and to pay people to do things. And so I hit it off with them so well at the last Ethereum conference I was at 3 weeks ago that they invited me on the floor at Madison Square Garden, and that was incredible. And so I think really memes and memes are the cutting edge of politics, and memes are also a part of crypto that can take off when it's done in a way that's not scammy, when it has a purpose behind it. And so, as you guys can imagine, I'm doing everything I can to try to figure out how we can get Pulse Chain adopted, how we can get Hex adopted, so on and so forth. And so what I can say is that that's going really well. I was I was in New York for that on Sunday. Then I flew to Vegas for a crypto conference for a couple days, and now I've just come back to New York, and this court date was incredible. I'm going to go ahead and summarize some of the notes that I took of what the highlights were. But again, you can go to the Twitter Spaces and see all the different takes. And I would also encourage people to tune in to all the other YouTubers that are covering this content. I know of many, and we are not competing with each other that I know of. Like, I am super excited that there are so many different voices, so many different publishers and people using free speech and different perspectives, because that is one of the biggest stories here is a hex is decentralized and it's organic, and it has not only some of the best game mechanics in all of crypto, top 5, but the community is, in my opinion, number 1. Best founder, best community, best crypto, and obviously the best legal team now we've seen firsthand. So yeah, let's go over the court date. So this was a federal case that was it was oral arguments to decide whether to cause a motion to dismiss, whether to throw out the case against Richard Hart, Hex, PulseChain, and PulseX. And again, I'm just going to try to touch on the most interesting things, maybe the top 5 or top 10 most interesting things that I heard, and then you can get the rest of your content elsewhere. So hit the like and subscribe button and share this out, because this should be a really good summary. So like I said, the number 1 takeaway, one of them was how competent the judge was at crypto. She has ruled before on a crypto case that created some precedent for things, and that was the PlexiCorp case. And both sides tried to relate this case to the case that the judge knew the most. But anybody sitting in the audience, anybody listening, you had to be incredibly impressed by the questions that she was asking. And I'll give you an example. She was, like, in my opinion, kind of like drawing a connection between the irrevocability of crypto, like, which we would call transaction finality or immutability, as being like relevant to the fact that if you're sacrificing, like, the funds are actually gone. And I should probably say that the judge did not make a ruling on this and has 60 days or longer to decide. Nuclear Herbs thinks that the judge will use most or much of that time. And so, as I've been saying, it would be great if we knew by the 5th online Hex conference here on January 6th through 9th every year. But that is just about 2.5 months away, and 2.25 months away. And how cool would it be for us to know? I was saying it'd be cool if we knew in 2 weeks. But once I heard more about what Nuclear Herbs said the judge is going to have to do with, like, all the write-ups and looking into some of the arguments that were presented, that's another thing that was notable today, was that Richard's team kept accusing, and in some cases the judge was accusing the SEC of bringing up new arguments, which is, looks bad. For example, there was one part where the SEC was saying there was some statement that they had latched onto that, that they said that Richard had said something about, I wish I had, like, a quote written down, but basically the idea was like, Pulse Chain is in the works or whatever. And basically the SEC had, like, presented kind of this new angle on that. And it was just clear to everybody keeping score, if they had such a strong argument, and if all the arguments that they were leading with weren't failing so bad, then they wouldn't have to come up with something new. And if it was so obvious that that was the biggest issue from the beginning, why didn't they write it up in their last 2 chances to do, like, these tens of pages of write-ups. Like I think one of their documents was 50 pages or 80 pages or in that range. So they've they really haven't made a strong case in a number of different ways, but that was interesting. One of the first things that was discussed is like the judge was pressing the SEC, have you abandoned your alter ego theory? Basically saying that that the software code of Hex and Pulse Chain and PulseX can be sued along with the person Richard Hart. And the SEC tried to make an argument that maybe we can still include that later, and the judge, I don't think, was buying it and basically called them out on the fact that you kind of have to abandon it now at the jurisdiction phase. And so that was kind of amusing to watch near the beginning of the oral arguments that the SEC failed to land that one, the alter ego hypothesis was abandoned. And that's really important because that means there's not precedent now that's likely to be formed that says that you can sue a blockchain. So that's a really big deal. Let's see here. So all of the arguments and like even like which of the two lawyers on each side were presenting different parts of the argument, they were broken down into these two different areas. One is jurisdiction, and then the other is fraud related to jurisdiction. And so, for example, jurisdiction might ask like, did Richard live in the US? Oh, no, he didn't. He lived in Finland, blah, blah, blah. And so like, there's the aspect of like, did he launch it when he was on US soil? Like, did he promote it, directing it at US citizens? And then, so that's kind of one aspect of jurisdiction. And then there's another aspect of jurisdiction, which is like, did he commit fraud? And was that fraud related to jurisdiction? So, did he say something only to US investors? Or did he target something? One thing I'm just remembering that the judge was pretty clear on is that the argument doesn't fly that you have to block people from the US if if you want to not be a security, which was a really cool thing to hear the judge be so definitive on, and seemingly. And so so basically that means that you don't have to do something proactive like blocking only US people in order to meet specifically these criteria of jurisdiction. Like just because you didn't block US investors doesn't mean that the US has jurisdiction, especially when something's being argued as being so worldwide. It's like the World Wide Web is what Richard's team was comparing it to, and it's like they came back to the word worldwide in a clever and a way that really clicked with the judge. And so the SEC was making a tough case that this software was targeted at US individuals, although that's when they really started to hammer the HEX conference, which is my conference, not Richard's conference. And I'm trying to if I knew they were going to bring it up so much, I would have counted how many times the SEC and the judge in particular, and it's in some case Richard's team, used the word HEX conference to only refer to the one that was in person in Las Vegas in 2022. And maybe it was brought up 20 times. Some wild amount of time and mentions were done for that specific conference because the SEC had cherry picked one or two sentences from 3 different points in time of Richard YouTubing. And I was saying in the Twitter spaces earlier, it's no wonder that Richard isn't YouTubing now, is because the SEC had used really, in some cases, weak arguments to highlight things that he was saying. So it I guess what I said on Twitter Spaces is that it made me understand a lot better why he's not streaming now. It's you know, when Richard was appearing on YouTube, he wasn't the main source of marketing for Hex, in my opinion, because we already had 100 YouTubers coming on my conferences from 100 different channels. And if you looked at the number of hours that we were putting in compared to what he was putting in, um, you know, I, I think it's hard to make like an argument that Hex was super centralized. You definitely couldn't make the argument that anybody was working for Richard from the YouTubers or anything like that, because none of us ever got paid by him. And so this was an organic thing, and that's really relevant. But it wasn't really used by the lawyers that much. The point that like it wasn't Richard's conference, and the judge kind of might have gotten the impression from the way that the SEC was misconstruing everything that it was kind of that this was somehow some sort of like marketing thing for Richard, which maybe most crypto conferences are like shill fests or sponsored basically, but in this case it's not. And that's particularly relevant to, whether jurisdiction even to broader parts of the case. If the SEC has only handpicked 3 kind of statements by Richard that are their best examples, that, supposedly he was promoting people to like invest in something with expectations, etc. Not only do the statements matter, and not only do the connection of the statements to the US matter, but it also matters. Oh shoot, what was I going to say? I've been running nonstop for the past several days, traveling all over the place. So yeah. So yeah, it's really everything really comes down to if a statement was made, was it directed at US people? And then, was it fraudulent or did it come true? And so it was really interesting that at one point the judge was challenging what the SEC was saying about a pulse chain being, like them thinking of it as a security because, because of a number of like different reasons. But the part I was thinking of is that, like, basically the judge was saying, well, a pulse chain got delivered, didn't it? So how's that fraud? Why is this a securities issue basically? And so it's interesting that most people probably got lost during this whole, during this whole court thing, because there are so many different elements of the law and like ways to like break down. You have to meet this criteria, and this criteria, and then what's a strong versus a weak argument for something like this. But it was funny because at one point one of Richard's lawyers was like scanning the room, and kind of looking to see who was following along, like who was showing the facial expressions of, yeah, I'm following along here. And when he looked at me, I raised my eyebrows, like, because I think he was trying to basically point out like, oh, something important just happened in the, oh, the SEC's case seems really weak there. And so it's funny because when he saw me raising my eyebrows, then he like winked at me or whatever. And I was like, all right, yeah, like, that's kind of funny that most of the time they weren't interacting with the crowd at all during the thing, but there was like one moment where one of the lawyers just really couldn't help himself because they were with their facial expressions, they were kind of keeping score and communicating amongst themselves through writing down on paper and whatnot. They were like using their entire team to figure out if there was anything they needed to argue back and forth with the SEC. But honestly, a lot of their arguments were landing better than the SEC's arguments. And when we okay, so let me try to do a quick zoom out here of like what are some big takeaways that I saw. Um, one of the biggest takeaways was the that it could be the case that Hex is dismissed based on jurisdiction, and that Pulse and PulseX continue like to the next stage of everything. It's also possible that all three could get dismissed, and it's also possible um, that none of them get dismissed. But I hadn't considered the option that maybe Hex would get dismissed and the other ones wouldn't. So that was particularly interesting, and there was a good amount of time spent like arguing whether these should be separate. The SEC made really weak arguments based on how many times the judge kept coming back around to it and asking the type of questions that made it seem like she wasn't hearing a good enough argument. The SEC really seemed to fail to draw the connection between how Hex, basically how like Hex should be considered a security when it was a finished product, and when they're claiming even statements that Richard made after the adoption amplifier only. Like the SEC, so that's like if I had to think of like the top 2 or 3 or 4 things to take away from this, it's like uh basically the possibility of like having a partial dismissal. That's important. Um Also like the competence of the judge was really high. And yeah, so there's a lot going on here. Um, the most memorable quote that I heard during the entire time was the judge saying to the SEC, "Where does the blockchain live? Where does the blockchain live?" Because the arguments were kind of going back and forth and falling apart, and you know, again, this is drawing it back to jurisdiction. There was one point where the SEC could only name like 10 people who were impacted by Hex and Pulse Chain and PulseX as like being US people that were negatively impacted by this. And the judge like was not impressed by that number. And because there were more than 10 people in the courtroom, the SEC's lawyer snarkily said to the judge, well, maybe we could have everybody raise their hand here and say whether they invested in Hex and whether they live in the US. And the judge said, oh, we're definitely not doing that. And I mean, seemed kind of like disrespectful of the SEC, like to, you know, to draw attention away from like everything that was happening, with respect to the judge. And it was also funny because I think if they had done that, they would have seen that there were way more international people there than what was thought. But okay, good. Yeah. So where does the blockchain live? Is like my favorite quote from the judge. We know that there may not have been sufficient investors in the U.S. Um, there was, yeah, there was a lot of attention focused on like 3 speaking events that Richard had done. And oh, I remember. Okay, so like in the top 3 things that happened, one was definitely the timeline. And that's what I want to share here. A big thing that was that Richard's lawyers had prepared, which is why we know it's part of like their strongest argument. I'm gonna pull it up here on screen shortly. Let's see. Oh yeah, this is really good stuff. So you can see the U.S. courthouse there, and a huge crowd of Hexicans behind it. And one Hexican is holding up this giant billboard that the Richard's team had put together, and it's describing the Hex adoption amplifier period that started on December 3rd, 2019, and ended on November 19th, 2020, and that the the statements, you can see over here, that were after that period, uh, that basically something that said after the alleged securities offering, that can't really be counted as part of like the fraud or the statements that were not true. And then you also have to decide whether the statement was true or not, right? So that gets back to this like multiple criteria in order to decide jurisdiction. But this is probably the number one thing that Richard's team used to make their strongest argument, was that the SEC's timeline didn't add up, that the evidence that they were providing to the court didn't, it wasn't overlapping with the period that the SEC was claiming that the offering happened. So this is the most important takeaway you can get, is this one image. And yeah, so hopefully that's helpful. Now what you see here is like the only overlap between the three statements or four statements that were made and the alleged offering periods of like the Hex adoption amplifier, the pulse chain sacrifice period, the pulse X sacrifice period, like all of that occurring before the statements, apparently. The only overlap is the March 2022 HEX conference in Las Vegas, where Dev Kyle basically had said in a statement that the pulse X sacrifice would, it didn't end when everybody thought it ended. So this argument is really weak. Okay. It's kind of even hard to explain, but basically the idea is Dev Kyle had made a statement to the SEC, and that was the best evidence that they could have, which was still weak evidence, that was saying that the pulse X sacrifice was still going on, which I don't know anybody who thought that it was still going on, but as you can see, that's the only overlap here. So this is this is really cool that SEC did such a poor job, and that Richard did such a good job at doing things within the law and within kind of this framework of freedom of speech and finished product and these types of things that you don't see in other crypto cases. At one point, Richard's lawyers compared HEX to Bitcoin, saying that it was a finished product and it didn't rely on further marketing from the founder, etc. So overall, I would say that all of this was incredibly promising. The confidence of Richard's lawyers, the way that they interacted with us after the event, they knew who I was and who Nuclear Herbs was, and we were thanking each other, like, surprisingly or unsurprisingly. But yeah, it was like I didn't expect them to like know who I was or to have listened to any of my streams, and it seems like apparently they had. So there was a lot of mutual respect happening there, and they were thanking us for doing everything we do for the community, and likewise. So that was really cool. And they stuck around and we're talking about lots of different things. They had to decline like doing an interview or anything, but they were talking shop about different stuff. So where do we stand? Basically, going into this, I thought the best case of a dismissal was like 50-50, and maybe less than that. Coming out of it, I think that the chance of a dismissal for Pulse and Pulse X is at least 50%. And the chance of HEX getting dismissed might be 60 or 70%, maybe 75%. So that's really, really encouraging, as you can tell. And, everybody's just so excited about it. I think they're still doing the Twitter spaces over there at x.com/MATI all in. And make sure once that space ends, I hope eventually people, wrap it up and basically then it'll be something you can go back and listen to. So yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So with that being said, you guys have heard kind of the top observations that I made. There was also interesting discussion about the diamond money wasn't an omission; it's on chain and public, so maybe that can't be fraud. There was an argument. There was a discussion about whether how it can even be applied because there's no contract here. When you send crypto, you've sent it and it's gone and you can't get it back. And so how can you have expectations or a contract in that regard? There it was the judge saying that there was promise versus fruition, and Pulse Chain did come to fruition. The global nature of everything was really considered an important. And yeah, so I hope that this was helpful. I hope that this gives you as much confidence as it gives me that that we're on the right track here, and we've got an amazing community, and really, really got a lot of stuff going for us. And I'm extremely grateful to everybody who came out. I got to meet people I've never met before, and a bunch of familiar faces as well. And so I think I'm going to be out there for part of the day tomorrow for the seminar that's happening. And yeah. So go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button, share this out, and we'll continue to discuss this on Tuesday. This has been an incredible day that really has to be digested by the entire community. I'm looking forward to all the different podcasts that Nuclear Herbs does, as well as everybody else who was in attendance. And yeah, so we'll discuss this more on Game Theory Gang on Tuesday night. And with that being said, hit the like, subscribe, share this out. And until next time, stake wisely, my friends, and peace out.